I've got good news and I've got bad news. Let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that the Trump administration has begun the formal transition process to the Biden administration in a limited way, but it has begun the transition process. Bad news. The good news, President Trump still has not conceded the election. The good news, there is still a long legal process that needs to play out. The good news, Bush v. Gore took 38 days. We're on day 21 of all this. Now, if the Biden transition does happen, if Biden does become president, boy, oh boy, are we in for it. Joe Biden has announced from the vaunted office of the president-elect that he has given himself, he announced that he's going to put John Kerry, the failed Secretary of State, into a new position in his administration. He will make him the climate czar. The climate czar. I didn't know there was a climate czar. I guess there isn't one, but now there will be. What this tells me, what this signals to me, this one appointment of John Kerry, is that the Biden administration, if it occurs, will be the coronavirus lockdown on steroids. It will be an administration of coronavirus lockdowns, not specifically with regard to coronavirus or the lockdown, but broadly to the idea that we are going to have our politics dictated to us by egghead idiots in white lab coats who are then interpreted by politicians who want to pretend that they're not being politicians. And the rules that come out of the Biden administration are going to all have the sheen and patina of science on them. John Kerry. And so if we're going to have these new scientific offices that we can't disagree with, that are not open to debate, do we think John Kerry is the right guy for this job? Some people forget this. John Kerry has been wrong about everything his whole life. I don't think he's ever been right about a single thing, ever, once. He's been wrong since he got back from Vietnam. He's been wrong since he was in the Senate. He was certainly wrong as Secretary of State. Do you remember when John Kerry was Secretary of State? He's coming into this role. He's speaking at the Brookings Institution. He comes in and he says that there is absolutely no way that you're going to have peace between Israel and Arab nations if you don't deal first with the Palestinian problem. Now, you'll recall, President Trump took a different approach to Israel and the Arab world than his predecessors in Obama, in Bush, in Clinton, in the other Bush, in all of these administrations. Trump took a different approach. He said, we're not going to deal with the Palestinian problem first. We're just going to deal with Israel and the Arab states. John Kerry said that was a complete disaster. There's no way that could ever possibly work. Take a listen to Secretary of State Thurston Howell III.
There will be no separate peace between Israel and the Arab world. I want to make that very clear to all of you. I've heard several prominent politicians in Israel sometimes saying, well, the Arab world's in a different place now. We just have to reach out to them and we can work some things with the Arab world and we'll deal with the Palestinians. No, 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 and no. I can tell you that reaffirmed even in the last week as I have talked to leaders of the Arab community. There will be no advance and separate peace with the Arab world without the Palestinian process and Palestinian peace. Everybody needs to understand that. That is a hard reality.
That's a hard reality that was completely disproven over the past 4 years. 100% shredded over the past 4 years. Donald Trump has completely ignored the Palestinian problem. He's just dealt with Israel's neighbors and Israel itself, and Israel has signed record peace deals with countless Arab neighbors. Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, leader of Israel, just headed over and met with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Historic. Hasn't happened before. Trump completely right, Kerry completely wrong. And Kerry might be completely and frequently wrong, but he's never in doubt. He's always so sure. He has that waspish drawl. Says, I promise you, Lovey, I swear to you as I sit here sipping my Pimm's cup, Israel will never have peace in the Middle East if we do not deal with Palestine. Thank you, Lovey. And it turned out that was completely wrong. Now, what sort of wrong-headed policies will John Kerry pursue as the climate czar? Could you imagine? He wasn't just wrong about the Palestinian issue in Israel, by the way. He was wrong about moving the embassy. You know, it was a U.S. policy for decades that the U.S. embassy in Israel should be in Jerusalem. In reality, it was in Tel Aviv because Americans were too afraid to put the embassy where they thought it would irritate the Palestinian Arabs. Well, so Donald Trump makes the same promises as everybody. He says, oh, I guess I'm supposed to put the embassy in Jerusalem. Okay, sounds good. Then he does it. I was talking to Senator Cruz on our podcast Verdict. And apparently, when the State Department came in, they presented the arguments for and against moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. You had arguments for moving it to Jerusalem, 0. Arguments against moving it to Jerusalem, a whole long list. Trump does it anyway. Turns out great. And then a lot of other countries follow suit, and they name a town in Israel after Donald Trump, who the left still calls an anti-Semite, apparently the least successful anti-Semite in human history. John Kerry insisted, if you move that embassy, you are going to have an explosion.
Kerry is also concerned about the Middle East, where he spent 9 months trying to secure peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. He said the president-elect's campaign pledge to move the U.S. embassy to the disputed city of Jerusalem would inflame the Arab world.
You'd have an explosion, an absolute explosion in the region.
An absolute explosion. Actually, you had peace. You had record peace. As I mentioned just a little bit earlier, on Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. This is the first publicly acknowledged meeting between a prime minister of the Israeli government and high-level officials of the Saudi Arabian government. Ever. Shocking record peace. If you had told even me 4 years ago that Donald Trump would bring peace to the Middle East, I would have laughed. Not because I don't think Trump, is a talented guy, just because I thought it was an intractable problem that both parties had tried for a long time to solve. Well, the reason that both parties couldn't solve it is because both parties had exactly the same approach. And Trump had a different approach. And the Trump approach worked. And now I do fear, if Trump is ushered off the stage, I fear that we're going to return to some kind of uniparty consensus. The same failed consensus among squishy Republicans and liberal Democrats that we've had for decades in this country. I do like, by the way, that what President Trump's doing is sort of hedging his bets here, taking the legal fight to the courts, still claiming that the election was fraudulent and that he will prevail in the end, but also figuring out how to get enough of his preferred deals in place before he leaves that Joe Biden can't screw it up too much. I think a lot of what this meeting was about as well is that both Israel and Saudi Arabia fear a renewed Iran nuclear deal if Joe Biden becomes president. And so they want to get their affairs in order before that can possibly happen.